Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories. Ladies and gentlemen, I now present to you an hour of the weirdest Pennsylvania Dogman and werewolf stories of all time.
Dogman versus albino Bigfoot. Dear Scary Stories NYC. There is a range of mountains and valleys that extend from Pennsylvania down into West Virginia, where people see and experience very strange things. Out-of-place animals, and possibly large birds, monsters with glowing red eyes, strange lights flying through the night sky, Sasquatch, and even Dogman. I have little doubt there are other things going on over there which we don't even know about yet. And in the middle of this most bizarre mountain range, there is a collection of natural areas dedicated to leaving the lands untouched, allowing them to maintain their aura of mystery into the present day, and hopefully off into the future. In this one area you can find Roth Rock State Forest, Bear Meadows Natural Area, Thickhead Mountain Wild Area, Allen Seeger Natural Area, Whipple Dam State Park, Penn Roosevelt State Park, Greenwood Furnace State Park, Stone Valley Recreation Area, plus others I'm leaving out. My childhood was mostly spent in these lands, and I usually didn't even know which of them I was in most of the time. My parents loved nature and would take me camping with them on nearly every vacation, most of each summer, and on every 3-day weekend. Sometimes we would bring a friend from school, but generally it was just the three of us, and it was usually a very relaxed and fun time. Sometimes it was educational, such as the times we saw a bear, and my parents showed me how to react to that. Sometimes it was terrifying, like the times we encountered cryptids in those bizarre woods. I'm not going to lie to you and say that I ever enjoyed a cryptid run-in, because I didn't. When one of those things were around, my heart would beat fast and hard. My sweat would pour off my head like it was fired from a hose, and my eyes would uncontrollably tear up. We'd been haunted by a dogman who I rank as second scariest of all. The worst for me personally was this entity that spoke to us from outside. It knew our names, and it knew secrets that we never told each other. That was a horrible beast, but we never actually saw it, and we never found out what that was or why that happened. Some people have suggested it was a demonic force, something more like a ghost than a cryptid. If we hadn't all heard the voice at the same time, I'd almost list it as a hallucination. We don't know why that creature or spirit tormented us that night, and we don't know why it never came back again. Maybe we left in the morning. We moved around out there so often. I want to tell you about a Dogman experience, and I want to tell you about the time we saw the Pennsylvania albino Sasquatch. Then, I'd like to fill up most of the rest of this with the story that's in the title, the time we saw a dogman going berserker on that white Bigfoot, who was the much larger of the two. Now, my parents were naturalists and experienced outdoors people, but they also had a sense of awe for what they knew they could not understand. Some science-oriented naturalists behave as though science had already figured out all the answers. My parents, on the other hand, taught me that science is the act of questioning. It's not a set of finished rules. In fact, we had this running joke, natural or unnatural, in our family. We'd return to it whenever we would experience that Alice in Wonderland topsy-turvy world. For instance, I saw a dog standing on its hind legs in the woods one night outside our window. It was staring at something I couldn't see what, and it was standing perfectly still. I couldn't tell if it was leaning against a tree to increase its height in order to see something further off, or if it was actually an upright walking canid. So I called my mom over and I asked her, "Mom, natural or unnatural?" Mom looked out the window and said, glowing eyes, "Unnatural," and pulled the shade down on that and all our windows for the rest of that night. Between then and dawn, curiosity was driving me insane. I wanted to lift those shades and peek outside more than I wanted anything else. But I was too afraid to look out there and risk seeing the Dogman looking right back in at me. There was a similar time when I called out natural or unnatural because I thought I saw a big black dogman standing out in the woods past our house. This time, my father answered natural, just before the creature I thought was a black dogman dropped to all fours and revealed himself to be a big old black bear. We would rent cabins when we could, and so camping life had a similarity with our home life back in Pittsburgh. There were times, though, when we would be camping out in the wilderness, and my first really serious dogman encounter took place on a night where Mom and Dad had a tent, and I had a second smaller one. We had already eaten dinner, roasted marshmallows, identified as many star systems as we could in the night sky, and finally went to bed. I was awakened by this sound that I thought was my father messing around outside the tents. He had put the campfire out before we retired, but sometimes he would forget something and go back outside to fuss around while I was trying to get some sleep. He usually wasn't out there for long, so I waited for him to finish and go back to bed. Except he didn't. He kept fussing around out there and I wasn't able to get back to sleep. Frustrated, I unzipped my tent, intending to stick my head out there and ask Dad if I could help him with whatever the problem was. I was that certain it was my father that I unzipped, but before I could stick my head outside, I screamed as this horse-sized wolf head inserted itself in the tent opening and backed me up as far as I could go. Its front arms also invaded my privacy, and I had its nose in my belly, both smelling me and keeping me pressed up against the back wall of my tent, still screaming bloody murder. I could hear my father and mother asking me what was wrong, but all I could do was continue to scream because this wolf head was as big as I was, and by that point, it was exposing its teeth to me and growling in an unfriendly manner. The eyes had eye shine even in the dark of my tent. These were the days before personal handheld electronics, so it's not like I had a cell phone for its eyes to reflect back the light of. I think I might have owned a calculator and a transistor radio, and I don't know if I had either of them with me on that trip. I never felt so scared in my life. I was beyond panicked. My fight or flight instinct had kicked in, but I was trapped against the back wall of my tent and incapable of running anywhere. The breath of the Dogman was so hot that it almost burned my belly. It was around then that something started happening outside the tent, something which caused discomfort to the Dogman. He pulled back out of the tent, and I heard my father screaming like a complete lunatic. I thought he was being torn limb from limb by the dog-headed monster, but he was actually going nuts and screaming while waving a stick around in order to scare the Dogman off. He either succeeded or at least confused the beast enough that it did return to the dark woods, and my father stuck his head inside my tent to see if I was all right. When he saw that I was uninjured, he got a broad smile and asked me, "Natural or unnatural?" Obviously, to me, that was unnatural. That was the Dogman. My father could joke around about things like that, but I could not. I climbed into their tent for the rest of that evening, but I don't think I got any more sleep. My dad could laugh off a Dogman experience, but I was very shaken up by those things. I still wish I could live on a planet that the Dogman never heard of. If I never see one of those again, it'll still be too soon for me. One time, we rented a cabin but decided to have a picnic dinner at the edge of a clearing past some woods behind the cabin. The sun was going down, and the sky was all sorts of incredible colors. It felt like an extremely peaceful setting, but feelings can be deceiving. We began to experience small objects dropping on us. At first we thought it was because we were under the edge of the tree cover, so we moved. The pelting of our area with small objects continued even as we walked down out of the tree cover and over by the water. Then my mother saw it. She said, "Look at that big old white sheepdog." But even as she said those words, that sheepdog stood up, revealing itself to be a bipedal character, well over 6 feet tall. You tell me what looks like a white sheepdog but stands up like a man. Some people have suggested that it was sheep squatch, but I think that it was an albino Bigfoot or Sasquatch. The eyes were pinkish or reddish, and I think that supports the contention that it was an albino. All I know is that once we saw that thing, we all grabbed what we could carry, beating it out of there, and heading straight back to our cabin. The rest of that night, I had that feeling that we were being watched. I think my parents did too, because they put coverings up over the 2 windows in that cabin. There were a couple of sounds during the night, like small rocks hitting the roof, but my father told me I didn't hear them. "I'll let you know when you've heard something," I remember him warning me sternly. He could be a little like a military general sometimes, which is probably why we survived these incidents. The next time we saw that albino Sasquatch, he did not at all look like a sheepdog, which leads me to question if there might have been more than one albino Bigfoot in the Pennsylvania woods in those days. My parents outnumber me on this issue. They insist that both times we saw a white Bigfoot, it was the same exact one. They say we just interpreted it as a sheepdog the first time because of the way its head was so close to the ground. The second time we saw a large white furred bipedal creature, in the story I'm about to relate to you, it did not have a face in any way like a sheepdog. It had a face that looked like an extremely creepy looking mix between an ape and a human. It was like the worst of both worlds. The ugliest things about a gorilla or chimp face, combined with the ugliest features any human ever sported. Nature, or whatever designed this monstrosity, clearly made him extra frightening to look at in order to defeat its prey and opponents before even throwing a single blow. I think I would have remembered a face that ugly if it was what I had seen in that first incident. But let's say my parents are right and that this was the same white Bigfoot as the first time. Some people suggest to me that it must have been the Yeti or the abominable snowman. In fact, those are not colored white like a polar bear. They are darkly furred according to legend. The concept of a white furred Yeti appears in the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer cartoon by Rankin Bass. I think they may be responsible for inventing that notion. So what we saw was not a Yeti, but it was a white Sasquatch. We came upon it while hiking just before dawn from one campsite to another. We were about to enter a clearing when Dad stopped us and pointed out that the large white creature seemed to be scavenging a fallen deer at the far end of the clearing. We remained behind trees and watched for a considerable amount of time. My mother tried to take a picture, but her camera made clicking and whirring noises, and the Bigfoot got up and spun around, looking to find the source of those strange camera sounds. They echoed a bit through the valley as we ducked down and hid, and soon the great beast went back to his meal. I don't remember if the photo even ever got developed. We were about to breathe a sigh of relief when the guy you've been waiting for, the Dogman, came up behind us suddenly, forcing us to back into the clearing. We hadn't heard or even smelled his approach, and I'm still not sure if he was sneaking up on us or sneaking up on the Bigfoot and his large buck. Whether by accident or design, The Dogman's sudden appearance pushed us out into the field, which drew the big white creature's attention in our direction, and therefore, in the direction of the Dogman. This was when I got my first really good look at the albino Bigfoot. I do think it was albino because of how pink its eyes were. It wasn't just a white Sasquatch, it was albino, and an ugly one at that. It was also as large as it was nasty looking. I would guess this was maybe 8 feet, maybe taller. I'm guessing because I'm not good at judging heights, but this seemed larger than humanly possible, so I'd say 8 feet, because 8 feet is too large to be a human. It was so close to human in proportions, but just a little off. The arms were a little too long. Its height was a little too impossible. It was right in front of me, but seemed like watching special effects somehow. It was hard to take your eyes off the thing. It was the most incredible creature I'd ever seen. The Dogman, by comparison, was the size of a tall man. He was built like an athlete, like a muscular but limber baseball or soccer player. He couldn't have been a man in disguise, though, because he had legs like a dog has, or rather, the hind legs of a hound. You couldn't fit human feet into those legs, so even though it only stood about 6 feet tall or slightly taller, it still could not have been a human being. When we backed out into the field, attracting the Squatch's attention, the Dogman for some reason followed us into that field. Again, I'm unclear what his motivation was in all of this. Was the Dogman after me and my family? Or did it want to scavenge what the Bigfoot was already scavenging? So now we were in this situation of being maybe 20 feet away from a wolf-headed animal man who just emerged from the woods in front of us, and an increasingly agitated white-furred albino Bigfoot about 100 feet behind us. Like I said, I'm bad at judging height and distances, but the Bigfoot was probably 5 times further behind than the Dogman was in front. To make things even more confusing, we were walking backward, away from the Dogman. I probably got my best look at the Dogman at that stage in the sequence of events, as it stood there in the very first light of dawn. The fur on the Dogman reminded me of a wolf's fur, the way different colors mixed to create an image of a gray dog. It was darker around the face and belly, where a normal wolf might be lighter. The skin under the fur was dark and leathery like a motorcycle jacket. Its eyes shone an almost white color, nothing like the pink color of the albino Squatch's eyes. The Dogman suddenly charged forward directly at where I was standing, so it was me he was after. When I saw my life flashing in front of my eyes, I ducked, dropping down to the ground, but still expecting the worst to happen any second. Instead, the great upright wolf bounded over me, each heavy footfall shaking the ground and bringing him step by step closer to the big white Squatch. So it wasn't me he was after. My dad grabbed my backpack and pulled me in the direction he and my mother were already running in. They just wanted to get away, while I wanted to find a good hiding spot to watch this fight from. We ran through the field diagonally away from the fight, so I was able to view the battle until we re-entered the woods on the far side. The Dogman barreled into the ape man, who appeared almost twice the other's size as they came together. Both of them fell into a tree, which split near the root. The enraged Bigfoot screamed like a woman being torn apart, and ripped much of what remained of that tree right out of the ground. It hurled the tree, which was heavy even for a Sasquatch, at the Dogman, who easily dodged the flying projectile and again leaped up onto the ape man. This time, the Dogman seemed to have his long claws stuck deeply into the matted, knotted fur of the immense white Bigfoot. No matter how the Squatch spun around or tried to get the Dogman off of him, the two only seemed to become more entrenched in each other. The ape man's terrifying squealing turned into a sickening gurgling sound as the canine man snapped savagely at the larger creature's throat. In that moment, Even though the fight was still very much in progress, I realized that the Dogman could take down a creature far larger than he was. My family and I stood no chance against him, and my parents were wise to be running away at the fastest speed possible. As we found ourselves back in the woods, unable to watch the fighting any longer, I have to say that the sounds echoing through that valley were not sounds that gave the impression that the Bigfoot was winning. To be honest, he seemed a bit confused when the Dogman attacked, whereas the wolf-headed man never seemed to lack a battle plan at all in that fight. Assuming the Dogman did win, I think it was the result of his sheer savagery, his sheer willingness to do battle in the fiercest way imaginable against the strongest foe possible. Our plans for that day were abandoned as we headed to an official campground and rented a cabin close to the office and public facilities. Whenever we'd have a close call like that, we'd go stay with the humans again for a while, until we got bored and felt adventurous all over again. But it took a long time before I personally felt adventurous again, after the morning that we witnessed the battle between Dogman versus albino Bigfoot.
The Dogman Family. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was younger, I saw Dogman near our property on more than one occasion. Well, twice to be specific. Both times from my bedroom window. I even called him Dogman when I spoke about him. I could tell that nobody in my family believed me, but I would tell them what I saw anyway. They would feign acting impressed, and it was annoying, but it was better than not telling anyone about it. I don't remember if I told any of my friends, but I know my parents and my sister would roll their eyes whenever I'd bring up the Dogman. I might have been the first in history to call him that, as this was years before the Linda Godfrey book came out. Was the name in use before that? This was in Pennsylvania, not Michigan or Wisconsin, by the way. So, let me describe what I saw. This was not the kind of Dogman with the pointed ears and the glowing eyes. This looked like the Shaggy DA or whatever, like a sheepdog with floppy ears that stood perfectly tall, like a man. I even think the feet were sort of like a man's, or really I guess long dog feet at the end of shaggy, human-like legs. What I'm trying to say is that it stood flat-footed, not on its toes like a lot of the drawings you see of Dogman these days. Another thing about it is that it walked around like a normal dog and also like a human. Let me tell you about the first time I saw it, or one of them, I should say. I was watching TV late one night, and I got up to sneak out to the bathroom. I wasn't supposed to still be awake, so I was watching the TV with the sound off. I snuck out to the bathroom, and when I got back, something caught my eye out of the window. It was a white, shaggy dog with gray patches on it, walking through the yard. It just looked like a dog. I think it had its tongue hanging out and the whole thing. But it got to this bush at the edge of the property and suddenly stood up on its hind legs. That really surprised me, and I wondered how it did that as much as I wondered why it did that. I guess I've never understood the how, but I found out the answer to the why question as a skunk emerged backward from the bush. I don't really know if it sprayed the dog or if it just threatened to, but that dog let out a sad howl like it had lost its best friend, then turned and ran straight back all the way across our backyard in the direction it came, but it never dropped back down to all fours. I tell you, it was an astounding sight, but still I had no idea that this was anything but a very, very large sheepdog. I even assumed it must belong to one of the neighbors. So It was an interesting event I got to witness, but I filed it away and didn't even mention it to my family. I hadn't really begun to think of it as a dogman yet. It was just a big old sheepdog that ran away on its hind legs after being scared of a skunk. I also kind of assumed the dog would come up in conversation with my family or the neighbors sooner or later, since a dog that can walk on its hind legs seemed interesting enough to eventually become the subject of the neighborhood scuttlebutt. Fast forward to probably almost 2 years later, when I again saw the Dogman outside of my window. In fact, this was the event that caused me to name him Dogman and to cease thinking of it as someone's pet sheepdog. This was the time when I saw it stalk and chase a deer. In fact, at first, the deer was all I noticed. I don't even know why it was in our yard in the middle of the night, but there it was. An adult male with big antlers. I find those animals beautiful, and because of that, I was very against all types of hunting throughout my childhood. I didn't want to see Bambi's mom get killed and all that stuff. I was very sincere about it, and I could see no good in hunting, or even in hunters. You might say I was a bit prejudiced. So, I was watching the deer and oohing and eyeing, and then some movement in the trees behind the deer caught my attention. Something was in those trees. I wondered if it might be more deer and grew excited. But when those trees parted and the other creature emerged, it was no deer. Out of those trees walked, and as you can guess, I mean walked on its hind legs, a dogman, very much like that first sheepdog. Possibly it was the same one. This time, the creature was walking as though sneaking up behind the deer. It was like Elmer Fudd sneaking up on Bugs Bunny, but in sheepdog form. Then the shaggy thing leaped on that deer, and I cried out in horror. It used its front paws like hands and held onto the antlers while it tried to bite the deer, missing the times I saw. The deer bolted, and the dogman practically rode it out of my sight, almost falling off, then regaining its hold a few times. That was no sheepdog. A sheepdog couldn't hold onto antlers with its paws, no matter how well it had been trained to walk on its hind legs. I had discovered a new species. But, as I mentioned earlier, it didn't matter, since nobody believed a word I said about the creature. Whenever anything went missing around the house after that, I got kidded that the dogman must have taken it, right? So, now fast forward a few more years. I was, I think, in high school by this point. I had taken to wandering in the woods behind the house, something I had never done when I was a kid. I guess I was at the age where I was both becoming more social and wanting more privacy both at the same time. So I was wandering through the woods when I saw, off in the distance, a little, tiny, young sheepdog. I decided it was my civic duty to trail it to its home, since there were hunters in those woods, and I wanted to know where those dogmen lived. I thought somehow I would be able to protect them from hunters if I knew where they stayed, although I'm certain I had no specific plan as to how I was going to accomplish that. So I kept as much distance from the puppy as I could, and I moved as quietly as I could, and I saw the puppy dogman scamper into a large cave entrance that I had no awareness of prior to that moment. I stayed in the bushes, watching and waiting to see if an adult would come out. I wondered how many of them were living at this location. Then I heard the scariest, craziest kind of growling that I ever heard, and it was coming from both above and behind me. I turned around and saw nothing but fur. I looked up and got greeted with dog saliva dripping onto my face from far above. It was an adult Dogman standing on its hind legs, towering over me. It smelled worse than wet dog, and I nearly fainted from the shock. I backed away out of the bushes and into the clearing in front of the cave. I thought this was the end, and I'm afraid I did not greet it bravely. Instead, I squealed and screeched and hyperventilated and held my arms and legs up in front of me, hoping to forestall the inevitable. The creature was baring its impressive fangs at me, curling its lips back, and for the first time, I could see its black eyes poking through the hair covering its sheepdog face. I shouted for help as loud as I could, but I didn't really expect any, fairly deep in the woods as I was. Then a deafening explosion went off nearby, and I was momentarily unable to hear anything over the ringing in my ears. When I opened my eyes, the Dogman was gone, apparently scared off by whatever had made that blast happen. Within seconds, a hunter ran over to me, asking me if I was all right. He was the one who had made the noise. He had fired a round off into the air, saving me from a particularly uncomfortable demise. After I calmed down, the hunter told me never to come back to this location, as this was the home of a dangerous and very rare predator. He also informed me that he took it upon himself to look out for these creatures, and that I must never tell anyone where they lived, as they would most certainly be hunted down as trophies. The hunter told me these beautiful monsters had just as much right to live their lives in peace as we did, and that we needed to respect that. I was kind of surprised to hear all that coming from the kind of person I had always thought of as soulless killers, and I learned a lot about the world that day. I learned that I didn't know very much about the world after all. I learned that I should give other people the benefit of the doubt before judging them. But most of all, I learned to keep my butt as far as possible from the home of the Dogman family.
The Dogman Bigfoot family. Cross the road. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I want to tell you a story my wife Sherry mocks me for telling. She calls it my song and dance, or she calls it Mama Papa Cryptid Stompa, after an old song from the 20th century. But if you ask her if she wasn't there when this all happened, she will admit that she in fact was. She's just tired of hearing about this story because it challenges her worldview. She likes to act as though I'm crazy because I saw this very diverse cryptid family. But the thing is that she saw the exact same thing that I saw. And what I saw was a mama Dogman, a daddy Bigfoot, and a family of ugly ducklings that I'm not sure I would know what to call. I know we're all created as God intended us to be. I know He loves all His children. It's just that those offspring were creatures from out of my worst nightmares, and I shiver at the mere idea of their existence. Let me explain to you exactly where this all happened, since I don't think you have any familiarity with this area. It's a part of Pennsylvania, sandwiched in between Ohio and western upstate New York, that I don't hear you talk about so much on your show. At the time, and this was almost 30 years ago, we were staying in Meadville, which was located near some friends and family that we had personal and business dealings with back then. In fact, this happened as my wife and I were heading out to a social gathering with those very same friends and family. We were driving north on Dixon, heading toward Woodcock Lake Park. It's not a long drive, we're talking about 6 or 7 miles maximum, so even though it was dark out as we drove up there to meet with our friends, we weren't feeling scared or anything like that. We had been hanging out a lot that summer in that area with those same people, and nothing weird ever happened except for this one night. Of course, these days and ever since then, I feel creeped out over there, even in the full light of a sunny noon day. But on that particular night in the early 1990s, Sherry and I were joking around and laughing and in a good mood. All of a sudden, the mood got changed for us, and drastically. I've sent you a screen grab of the area this happened in, which I took from Google Street View. You see how the road has trees and nature on both sides, and you can't see very far off the road. This was early nighttime, so the visibility would have been even less than in this picture. From the right side over there ahead of us ran this big Sasquatch. It came out of the woods at us, bellowing and running straight for our car. Naturally, I slammed on the brakes and we locked our doors. I had not known that Bigfoot existed in this part of the country, but we both instantly knew this was a Sasquatch that we were seeing running toward us. We had seen enough TV shows and movies by then to know what a Bigfoot was, and this looked enough like your standard one that we didn't have to put too much thinking into it. It was larger than a man could be, and I don't just mean that it was tall. It seemed proportionally larger than a man. Heck, it was bigger than a bear standing on its hind legs, or at least any bear that I've ever seen. Its steps shook the ground underneath our car, and it looked to have enough strength to smash the entire front end. It looked to be as strong as a Jack Kirby superhero from back in the 1960s, like the Thing from the Fantastic Four, if you know the reference. He's the big orange one that looks like he's made out of rocks. Only this big Sasquatch was not wearing any underpants. So I braced for impact when that Bigfoot stopped short directly in front of our bumper, and he shouted at us. It was terrifying, but it sure beat the heck out of him, beating the heck out of us. I was beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I was thinking, just let the Bigfoot yell at us as long as it wants to, then it'll go away, and life can return to normal. This was my new dream in that moment, but I watched that dream die as I saw not one, not two, but 3 strange-looking creatures amble and prance out onto the road. Lit by our headlights were small hairy creatures that resembled apes, and yet at the same time appeared canine in some ways. Like the hands were those of a monkey, but the ears, those were dog ears, and each of the 3 of them were different from the other 2. One tail was long and seemed prehensile, another was short, and I'm not sure the third one had a tail at all. Neither my wife nor I knew what to make of any of this, so we just sat there in the car, staring out through the windshield, having our minds blown by what we saw, and our eardrums blown out by all that shouting. This was the most nerve-wracking moment of my life up to that point, but things were about to get a whole lot more hectic. Out of those woods flew a kind of a creature which I really had no vocabulary to explain back then. Same with Sherry. We instantly knew the first creature was a Bigfoot, but the only thing we knew for certain about the second one was that it was female. We knew that because it walked upright like the Bigfoot, and we could see she was capable of nursing her young. Those 3 smaller animals had to have been her young. Honestly, I at first thought that the next moment would feature the Bigfoot and this large, savage, upright walking canine fighting it out. But what happened was very nearly the opposite of that. The Bigfoot backed off and allowed the female canine creature to take over, yelling at us. This female had a long snout and vicious-looking fangs like the big bad wolf, and she was covered in a dark gray shade of dog fur. Its ears were adult versions of the ears on the young creatures, although the younger ones all shared the light brown or even somewhat orange coloring of the Bigfoot. Somewhere in the middle of being barked at and growled at and otherwise verbally assaulted by the upright walking female canine, my brain put it all together that this motley crew were in fact a family. They had to be. My wife, as I mentioned, doesn't like to talk about that evening anymore, but when she used to say that the dog sounded like it was barking in complete sentences. It didn't sound random. It sounded like a language. Just not a language that she or I knew. Ever since Sherry said that, I had to agree, but it's hard to say for sure. It could very well have just been animal noises, and the idea that we were hearing real language might have been a result of how frightened we were in that moment. So the little ones had finished crossing the road, and the Bigfoot was trying to get his mate's attention. She was too busy telling us what she thought of us, which was not very much. I never felt such complete loathing before. I never felt so disliked. I hadn't even done anything but exist. So I guess this must have been one of those overprotective mothers. The Bigfoot came over toward us, and I got even more scared. So far, we'd only been threatened. We had not had ourselves or our car actually attacked. I didn't like the idea of these two large creatures double-teaming us, though, and neither did my wife. Sherry was crying by this point in the story, and it's possible I might have been as well. Things were not looking good for us. The Bigfoot reached out with an incredibly long arm, and he placed that hand gently on the female Dogman's shoulder, as if to calm her down. Rather than taking his suggestion, though, the Dogman completely flipped out. Our grandkids might say that the upright canine got triggered. She turned and savagely tried to gnaw that Bigfoot's hand off at the wrist for daring to touch her. He backed off quickly, and the dog woman jumped on our hood, getting right up to our windshield and snarling while displaying her formidable set of teeth to us. Believe me, we backed up as far into our seats as we could. Eventually, she was done telling us what she thought of us, and she just pulled back off the hood, shook off her anger, and then turned and dropped to all fours, rudely pushing the Squatch to the side as she ran off after her children in the brush. The Bigfoot, for his part, gave us a look and a snort that might have meant nothing at all, but sure seemed to be saying, "Sorry, folks, she's always like this." Then he, too, disappeared into the night alongside the road. After that, Sherry and I weren't much in the mood for hanging out in the woods, so we talked our friends into letting us hang out inside their house instead. All night, every little sound we heard from outside shook us up, and we eventually just stayed over for the night. My wife says this strange sighting never changed our lives or our behavior in any way, but I say we made sure to get where we were going to before sundown for years afterward, and that's not nothing. She can downplay the importance of this encounter all she wants, but I separate our married life into two sections. Before and after we saw the Dogman Bigfoot family cross the road.
Dogman forced me to move. Dear Scary Stories NYC. My wife and I ran into a lump sum of money when a relative we barely knew died. It was quite a surprise and changed our tax bracket, among other things. We were able to afford to move to the country in Pennsylvania, but close enough to the city that I could become a commuter and keep my job. My wife was able to afford to cut back to part-time work she could do from home, and she soon began expecting our first child. We had a dog named Scrapper that moved with us to the country. By that point, Scrapper was getting older, and he mostly liked to sit or lay around all day. He perked up a lot at first when we moved because now he could sit around or lay around on the grass outside, as a dog naturally prefers. All three of us were very happy, and it felt like only weeks passed until we had our son, who I will call Jasper, which is not his real name. We could not have been more content, but as you know, nothing that good can last for long. Scrapper suddenly no longer wanted to be outside. I mean, not at all. My wife thought he needed to see the vet, but I decided to take him out back and sit with him for a while to try to figure out what was going on with him. He instantly began whining and asking to be let back in, but I carried him myself further out into the yard, and we sat down on the grass. I put him down next to me. He remained there, but was just as agitated, yet too afraid to run the distance back to the door by himself, so he stayed by my side. He kept whimpering and staring at the door, and occasionally barking at me, asking me to please go back inside with him. After some time, we both heard something out in the woods at the edge of the property, and poor Scrapper, completely freaked out, panicked and unsure what to do. I looked toward the woods, and I swear to you, I saw what looked like a wolf peering out at us through the branches. Well, peering out at Scrapper, I should say. The poor dog looked like he was going to have a heart attack. I have to admit, my heart was going pretty fast itself, as the head of the wolf was up so high in the air. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. Was the wolf in the tree? Was there some raised surface back there that I was unaware of? How could the wolf's head be so high up? And then, the most terrifying thing I had ever seen happened. That wolf emerged from the forest, and I could see it was standing on its hind legs. It was actually over 6 feet tall, and I'm certain of that, because I'm 6 feet, and that thing was way taller than I was. Scrapper and I bolted back inside, and I double-locked the back door. My wife told me to stop making so much noise that it would wake the baby. I was totally freaked out, and I couldn't calm down. Imagine how you would feel if you'd just been maybe 20 feet from something like that. I could barely form words, and I was shaking all over. Sure enough, I woke the baby up, screaming and crying. Now my wife was in a terrible mood. I told her to come look out back at what I had seen, but she wouldn't look, and it had left already, as you might expect. I couldn't even find Scrapper. He was hiding somewhere in the house, but I kept looking. I was worried about him, and with my wife furious at me, he was basically my only friend left at that moment. I was told that since I loved Scrapper so much, he and I could share the couch that night. My wife said she didn't want either of us waking the baby up again. I found it upsetting that she wouldn't even listen to me about what had happened, and she didn't even care that I was nearly in a state of shock. I wanted to move out ASAP, but my wife thought I was crazy. She ordered me never to speak to her about this supposed wolf-headed man ever again, and I became furious at the disrespect. We started arguing more than we didn't, and soon it became me and Scrapper versus her and the baby. One day, I went out with Scrapper for a very long walk. I didn't feel like there was anything to go home to anymore. The Dogman had ruined my home life. By that point, Scrapper was finding it harder to walk, and I knew his days were numbered. It seemed so unfair that the end of his life should be filled with fear of that wolf-headed man. I wanted to move so badly that I considered getting a place for myself and the dog. I didn't do it though, because I couldn't bear the thought of leaving the baby. I felt like I should be with Jasper as much as I could, because I know what it's like to be abandoned by a parent, and that can hurt for life. So, when Scrapper and I came home and found my wife sitting wide-eyed, shaking all over, the baby crying hysterically, and her doing nothing about it, I had a sneaking suspicion I knew what happened even before she said a single word. "You saw it, didn't you?" I asked. She stared straight ahead, and I wasn't sure if she had heard me or if she had understood. I was about to ask again when she nodded her head in the affirmative. She spoke with a quavering voice, stuttering frequently, but she told me the monster had come. It had walked out of the bushes. It was big and gray, and its eyes looked like something from the underworld. She said it stared at our baby, never flinching. It stared at our baby and walked toward him. I noticed she was dirty and asked if she was okay. She said she fell coming back in the house and almost dropped Jasper but hadn't. She told me we had to move, but that I would need to airlift her out with a helicopter because she was too afraid to walk outside ever again. I had to laugh at that, but I turned away and tried to make it look like I was crying until I could suppress my smiling. I told her I'd bring the car right to the front door and escort her out. She was against it, but I just went and got the car anyhow. When I came back, she had collected the baby's stuff, and she didn't argue as I led her to the car. She kept looking around in a panicked way. It was clear she was expecting the monster to attack from any angle, and that she had been thoroughly traumatized by her experience. We never returned to that house, either of us. We hired movers to bring our stuff to our new apartment back in the city. We wanted no more of the Pennsylvania countryside. It's beautiful, I'll grant you that, but it's weird. And besides, it's the turf of that Dogman that forced me to move.
We saw Dogman on his day off. Dear Scary Stories NYC. My friend Gio and I had a Dogman sighting way back in the late 1980s at the Hewitt Covered Bridge. That's in Pennsylvania. I'll tell you everything about that sighting because I think it's pretty interesting. It was terrifying to us in the moment, but when we tell the story to others, we've noticed that they don't always seem to think it's a very frightening narrative. Even after all these years, we must still not be telling it right, because at the time, we were shaking all over, thinking we weren't going to make it out alive. I think the only reason we did get out was a combination of luck and the fact that we had actually spent a decent amount of time thinking and talking to each other about the Dogman before any of this happened. You see, I had, and still have, relatives in Michigan who mailed me a cassette recording of the famous Legend of the Dogman song from up there. So all my family and friends knew the legend and the song by heart. Also, Gio and I had recently heard of two unquestionably scary Dogman experiences in that same area from that same era. So maybe if I tell you how those went down first, then you'll be closer to our head state, when we narrowly avoided a sunset run-in with this creepy beast man. So there's an exotic hunting lodge in this area. I'm not going to mention them by name, but everything I'm going to tell you about all happened in this one area. You can see in this overhead Google Map view. This is the entire world as far as this collection of Dogman narratives go. It's an area of Pennsylvania just north of Maryland, and it's in a valley associated with those mysterious haunted mountains which continue on down into West Virginia. Imagine you're with us back in 1987 or 88 during the time of the Michigan Dogman craze. Anyway, my friend's dad used to work at this hunting lodge years earlier as some sort of servant or bartender or something, I don't remember. Now, I also don't know how true this story is, but my friend told me that his dad said to him that one day this rich guy came into the lodge acting all dramatic and injured. He was claiming he had been chased through the woods by a creature that he wasn't warned would be in the hunting area. You see, this privately owned institution stocks the forest with rare and exotic animals for the rich people to hunt. So no matter how strange looking the animals are out there, the paying customers assume the creatures were placed there by the management. Since the kind of creature this guy was describing sounded a lot like a werewolf or a dogman, my friend's father's ears went into alarm mode, and he eavesdropped on everything else that guy had to say for as long as he could manage. Now remember, this is me and Gio recalling our friend describing his dad, remembering what this rich club member had to say when the guy was stressed out and apparently run a great distance to get there. And all of this is assuming my friend wasn't just giving us the plot of an old TV movie to see how gullible we were. To the best of my and Gio's memory, the supposedly true story went down like this. First, let's call our friend's dad the bartender, even though we don't remember what job he actually had. So the bartender said this rich guy was claiming he was chasing down some exotic goat he had scored a hit on when he came upon his prey already being devoured by a very large and very hungry-looking canine. If it was indeed a wolf, it looked unlike any the hunter had seen before, and even assuming that it was, the height and girth of the thing was on a much larger scale than your average wolf. He indicated that there were also other differences, including a sort of dull brownish coloring that he'd never seen on a wolf. So according to the bartender, this rich hunter said he began to slowly back away, but that wasn't good enough for the big bad wolf. Now the next part of the story is the most important part, but it's also the most fantastic part. Allegedly, that wolf or canine stood up in one clean, simple motion and turned around in a single, elegant maneuver. Now it was looking down at the rich hunter, and said hunter now had to look up to even see the great beast's chest. It was standing up tall, larger than the largest grizzly, but this was no grizzly. This next part was prefaced by the hunter himself, saying that he must have imagined or hallucinated it, but he did admit that when the beast was standing, its front paws free to be held threateningly in front of the smaller, weaker human's face. Those paws looked far more like hands or claws than they did like paws. He had thought he was seeing dog paws when the creature was down, but they did not look like paws when the creature stood to face him. So had they changed? Or, assuming they had not, was the hunter wrong about what they had looked like at first? Or was he confused when he thought they looked like hands? At least the guy was honest about what he saw, so I guess you can make up your own mind about that, since he couldn't himself. Anyway, this guy thought that the Dogman was placed there deliberately by the management, and so he wanted to know what the beast was called. They tried to inform him that they did not place him there, and that in fact there was no such animal, not in the zoological nor in the geological history of the planet. But as you can imagine, that did not go over very well with this witness. So there was an assumption that the guy was lying about being attacked by a werewolf, that he was probably part of a conspiracy from competitors who were trying to put them out of business. Nobody could prove that theory, though. The club was closed for one day and searched, just in case the Dogman turned out to either be a real animal or some nut job wearing a werewolf costume. But nothing was found, and soon the club was reopened. As with most Dogman stories, I'm pretty sure he'll never pop up in that same location ever again. He did, however, pop up soon after that, very nearby. Now, there are a number of areas all around over here called the Buchanan State Forest, Almost everything that isn't privately owned is state forest land, and both are interspersed within each other all over the place. This next story is supposed to have happened in the part of the Buchanan State Forest sort of to the northwest of the Hewitt-covered bridge and to the southwest of Whispering Hollow. Geo heard this story from his brother, and I heard the same story from a cousin of mine. There are some slight differences between the two versions, but they're similar enough that there must be some truth behind them somewhere. The way it went was that this rich lady went camping with her butler, right? And she made him do all the work while she laid around, talking about how she was at one with nature or whatever nonsense. So then she sends her assistant off to gather wood to build a fire, and about an hour of daydreaming later, the rich woman realizes that her manservant had never come back. By this point in the day, it was starting to get dark, so the rich woman was angry and belligerent. She shouted for her man. Then she stood, and she shouted some more. She looked around for her walking shoes. Normally she could have just had them brought to her, so it took some time to find those babies, but she succeeded eventually. The rich lady walked toward where her employee had gone off into the trees. Or had he walked the other way? She couldn't remember for certain, and it was getting darker. The lady walked the edge of the woods, at first shouting for her manservant. Then, feeling increasingly intimidated, she began lowering her voice to a whisper. Seeing and hearing a disturbance in the woodline a bit further down, the woman excitedly jogged toward that spot, calling out the name of her assistant. Noticing someone lying on the ground, the woman gasped even before she recognized her servant's clothing. There was dark maroon stained dirt, forming curvy geometric shapes around the still form, and the lady understood that her man was finished. It took another second or two for her shocked nervous system to take in the fact that the animal which had done her servant in was still there, still leaning over his kill. Only now he was not looking down at what he had done. Now he was looking ahead of him, at that rich lady. So the version of it that the fancy people like continues at this point into a description of the rich lady's remarkable prowess with her tiny lady hand pistol that she always carried with her. She is supposed to have subdued the monster with that. The other version that normal people tell is that the lady got completely lucky because a park ranger happened to walk out into the clearing at that exact moment, and that caused the Dogman to run away. This version makes more sense to me in a lot of ways, but I know some folks who swear by the other version, which they think is more feminist. At any rate, this was a long time ago, so we're talking long before cell phones, long before the internet and search engines. When a rumor went around back then, it went around unchecked, and nobody really knew which parts of which rumors had any veracity whatsoever. But then, of course, years later, the internet was invented, and all arguments or disagreements of any sort ceased forever and disappeared from human history. I'm joking around, of course, but seriously, the world was a different place back then, because we all lived in the gray area more than in either black or white. Maybe almost always seemed a better answer than yes or no to me back then, since we were going on even less hard information than we are today. And how can you make decisions with confidence if you're lacking so many different variables to the equation? When did that song come out about the legend of the Dogman or whatever it was called? There was that DJ in Michigan, and he made the song as a spooky Halloween promotion for his radio station. But so many people responded strongly to it, informing the guy that the Dogman is in fact more than just a legend, that the Dogman became a brief media sensation. I know this all happened sometime after that song was out. I remember without any doubt that the song had been around and everyone I knew had heard of the Dogman. Not everyone knew that he could walk bipedally, but they all knew about the large dog-headed beast alleged to be lurking through the wilderness areas of the Midwest and Pennsylvania. That's not to say that they all believed. Some thought it began and ended as a radio publicity stunt. Those who had seen the thing, or knew someone who had seen the thing, well, those people believed. More than that, those people knew that the Dogman was real. I once made a Super 8 student film with two of my friends who had both told me that they'd seen a Dogman. Both of them told their Dogman story to me so convincingly I could almost smell the monster. In my film, all they had to do was say they saw Bigfoot and make it sound as convincing as their Dogman stories were. Well, neither could handle the task, which confused me at first. After a while, when I compared the video of them talking about their Dogman sightings to them talking about seeing the fictional Bigfoot in my movie, I realized what the difference was, why their claims to see Dogman were so much more riveting and convincing than their claims to see Sasquatch. I'm sure you've already figured it out yourself. Maybe it's simple. Maybe the Dogman sightings just really happened to them. Either that, or they were for whatever reason convinced that they actually had run into and been menaced by this dog-headed cryptid. Maybe they had convinced themselves, or maybe they had been hypnotized, or maybe it just really happened. I don't know. They were not acting when they talked about the Dogman, though. I can prove that, because they are incapable of being convincing when they are acting. They were trying as hard as they could, but they had no training, and they didn't really have much raw talent either. My direction was lacking as well, since I had thought that their performances relating how they both nearly lost their lives at the clawed hands of the Dogman were brilliant. But it turned out they were not performances at all. They were just two people listing facts that happened to them, as well as they could remember. So Gio and I had already experienced being told all these stories. And you have to remember the times. We were living in the time of the 1987 Dogman revival. That really heightened fascination with the Midwest Dogman, even though the song was actually first intended as a joke by the Traverse City, Michigan radio DJ, Steve Cook. Knowing he was kidding didn't mean that we were kidding. His joking around was fine with us. We enjoyed it. And that didn't stop or even slow down our interest in the subject of the Dogman. Nobody I knew felt the radio song being intended as tongue-in-cheek meant that the Dogman itself was a hoax. If anything, the song brought more real eyewitnesses and eyewitness accounts to public attention than anything else I can remember, at least until the Gable film, 20 years later. So the one time that Gio and I actually got to see the Dogman with our own eyes was at that old wooden-covered bridge, the Hewitt-covered bridge. We got there before the Dogman that afternoon. You see, to get there, you drive to this point here on Town Creek Road, and then you make the turnoff onto this tiny little strip of tar called Covered Bridge Road. Keep driving till you find the bridge, as the road isn't used for too much more these days other than visiting that there bridge. Now, as far as I know, there's nothing weird about this bridge. It's not, as far as I know, a crybaby bridge. It's not a haunted bridge. It's not a troll bridge or a toll bridge. I don't know of any legends associated with this bridge, although I'm sure there must be at least one. We just wanted to drive out there and look at it, because Gio and I always liked looking at old things. That was about the long and short of it. We were like some 70-year-old married couple wanting to drive through nature and see the sights, even though we were actually just two 20-year-old boys, normal in most other ways. We drove through the bridge and off into the woods a bit on the other side of it. We parked off the road in a clearing by the woods, and we got out and played frisbee. When it was just starting to get dark, we wanted to get going back to Gio's place because there was some good scary movie on TV that night. That was back when you had to be in front of the TV at a specific time to see the show. I mean, yes, we both had VCRs, and yes, we both had timers on our VCRs, but when I didn't screw up programming that timer, and when Gio didn't screw up, then the VCR screwed up, because it seemed that most of the time we'd use that timer, we'd end up recording shows on the wrong channel or at the wrong time. I really preferred being there to start the recording myself, manually, just to make sure it was working properly. And besides, that way I could take the commercials out in real time while recording whatever show it was. So we got our act together and started walking back toward we left the car. Only Gio saw something of interest, which he pointed out to me. It was a Dogman. It was a Michigan Dogman in Pennsylvania, and I was seeing it with my own eyes. This was not like a guy in a ghillie suit running around on all fours, pretending like he was a dog. This was a lot more like something out of The Howling, or Dog Soldiers, which came many years later. I forget if The Howling was out yet by then, but this was an upright walking beast with a head like a canine. But that head was like a really, really huge canine head, you know? I didn't even realize that I was standing there staring with my mouth hanging open until Gio pulled me into the bushes, out of the range of vision of that Dogman. I was so surprised that I had lost my ability to notice that I was in danger. It wasn't just like seeing a dog head attached to a humanoid body. It was more like a really husky and super muscular canine that had developed huge pectoral muscles somehow over its many years of evolution. I mean, I think it was something more like a dog that developed characteristics like a human than I think it was like a humanoid who had become like a dog. I don't think it was a werewolf. I don't think it was a shapeshifter. I think it was a kind of a canine that just isn't listed in the textbooks yet. It might be a super intelligent canine, possibly. It might be the most advanced species of canine of all time. But I still don't think it was a human on our level, possessing our kind of intelligence. And yet, in spite of all that, I could completely identify with him and what he was doing in that moment. And what was he doing? He was enjoying the evening. The Dogman walked casually and leisurely up to that covered bridge. When he reached the entrance, he ran his clawed hand along the wood on either side of him, and then entered, staring upward at the ceiling. He looked like a kid getting to walk inside a covered bridge for the first time. A 6'7" hairy kid, but a kid nonetheless. The Beastman walked through to the other side of the bridge, then turned around and walked back again, clearly enjoying himself fully. When he re-emerged on our side, the Dogman noticed a large, colorful, flowering weed off to the side of the road. Bending down, I watched as the Dogman literally took the time to smell the flowers before strolling on back into the woods that he must have emerged from in the first place. As soon as he was out of our sight, we made a run for my car, and we got out of there as fast as the old hand-me-down bucket of bolts my parents had given me would take us. I was shaking so hard, it was difficult to steer the wheel or pump the gas and brake. Suddenly I felt like a little kid in a giant car, too large to operate. Suddenly I wished my parents could be there to drive me home. I was just being a little jerk. The Dogman was walking in the opposite direction. I was just a chicken, that's all. Once we hit the highway, then all of a sudden, we were both like, "Woo! High five! We just hung out with the Dogman," and that sort of thing. Like, we were chilling with the Dogman. Gotta take the time to smell the roses, bro. And the weeds too, I guess. Take it from me, Gio, and the Dogman. We know about these things. You know how once a terrifying experience is over, then suddenly in your mind it becomes the most fun experience of all time? If that Dogman had seen us hiding there, and if he decided to throw a fit about it in that moment, then we might not have been high-fiving each other that soon afterward. We were lucky that the Dogman left, and that it was in a good mood. So no, we didn't see a Dogman fighting a Sasquatch, or a Dogman battling a werewolf, or a Dogman piloting a UFO, or anything like that. But we did see something that's just as rare to witness. saw Dogman on his day off. The Covered Bridge Dogman of Pennsylvania. First, Summit Cut Bridge. I can't believe I let my boys talk me into this. It's midnight, and we're driving out to the Summit Cut Bridge in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. My 3 boys, all under the age of 15, are begging me to take them out to see the bridge and maybe even hear and see some ghosts, like the White Lady of the bridge. I know it's a bad idea, but I can't say no to their wide-eyed faces and the excitement in their voices. As I already mentioned, the Summit Cut Bridge is located in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. It's a historic landmark that dates back to the early 1900s. The bridge spans over a deep ravine that was once used to transport coal and other goods through the region. The bridge has an interesting history, I think. According to the National Register of Historic Places, the Summit Cut Bridge was constructed in 1910 by the Pennsylvania Bridge Company. It's made of steel and concrete and is 420 feet in length. In 2006, the Summit Cut Bridge was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Visitors to Beaver Falls can drive or walk across the bridge to see stunning views of the surrounding area. My 3 boys, all under the age of 15, are begging me to take them out to see the bridge and maybe even hear and see some ghosts. I know it's a bad idea, but I can't say no to their wide-eyed faces and the excitement in their voices. The Summit Cut Bridge is steeped in folklore and legend. One such legend speaks of a ghostly presence that lurks around the bridge. It is said that a woman with a baby was crossing the bridge when the horse-drawn carriage fell into the creek below. Both the mother and child drowned, and their spirits are said to haunt the bridge to this day. Some claim that the apparition of a woman holding a baby can be seen walking across the bridge at night. Others reported hearing strange noises, such as the sound of children's laughter, when there is no one around. Another eerie legend surrounding Summit Cut Bridge states that a group of young people were hanging out at the bridge in the 1950s when a car approached with its headlights off. The car collided with one of the youths, killing him instantly. It is believed that the ghost of the young man still lingers around and haunts that bridge. Visitors reported seeing a ghostly figure walking across the bridge at night and hearing strange noises that they can't explain. Despite these ghost stories, the Summit Cut Bridge remains a beloved historical landmark in Pennsylvania. When you get there, it's not really like a covered bridge or anything. It just looks like another part of the road. But when you look over the edge, that's when you see the train tracks far below. That's why I pulled my kids back from looking over that edge. So now back to that night when I was driving my boys there. As we pull up to the bridge, my heart starts to race. It's pitch black outside, and the only light we have is from the headlights of the car. We all pile out, and I can't help but feel a sense of unease. The boys, however, are thrilled. They're running around and shouting, hoping to attract some spirits. I try to keep my eyes peeled, but I'm distracted by their energy. And then, it happens. A deep, terrifying growling noise starts to emanate. I feel a chill run down my spine. The boys stop in their tracks, and we all stare in horror as a huge, 10-foot-tall creature emerges from the darkness. "That's no ghost," my eldest shouts. He's right. It's a Dogman, and it's coming straight for us. I scream for the boys to run back to the car, but they're too scared to move. The Dogman is growling and snarling, walking closer and closer on its hind legs, just like he was a human being. I grab their hands and I start pulling them back toward the car. We scramble into the vehicle, but the Dogman isn't done with us yet. It bangs on my hood as I start to scream louder than the kids. I start the engine, and the sound seems to frighten the beast, so it backs off, and I hit the gas, screeching out of there. It starts to chase us down the road, its deep voice reverberating through the night. I'm stomping the gas pedal as hard as I can, trying to get some distance between us and that terrifying creature. Finally, we reach the highway, and the Dogman stops chasing us. We're all breathing heavily and shaking with fear. I can't believe what just happened. Looking back, I'm not sure what possessed me to take my boys out to that bridge in the middle of the night. But one thing is for sure, I'll never forget the terror of being chased by a Dogman. As a mother, I urge all mothers out there to take care when letting their children go on legend trips, or even consider banning the practice outright. There are real dangers that come with these pastimes that cannot be ignored. While it may seem like harmless fun to search for the paranormal, the truth is that many of the places associated with urban legends are located in dangerous areas. Trespassing on private property, venturing into abandoned or condemned buildings, or exploring remote areas where wild animals roam free can lead to serious injury, or worse. Additionally, the heightened emotions and fear associated with legend tripping can make it easy for children and teenagers to lose their sense of perception and judgment. This can lead to them making bad decisions and putting themselves or others in harm's way. As such, I implore all mothers out there to take the responsibility of their children's safety seriously and to think twice before allowing them to engage in this type of activity. Instead, we should be encouraging our children to pursue hobbies and interests that are both safe and fulfilling. In conclusion, legends and folklore are an important part of our cultural heritage, but we must be mindful of the dangers that come with these pursuits. By taking care when going legend tripping, or possibly even banning the practice entirely, we can ensure that our children remain safe and free from harm. The previous opinion does not necessarily reflect that of the management. 2. The Cogan House Howler. Dear Scary Stories NYC, as my wife and I set out on our legend trip to see the Cogan House covered bridge, I couldn't wait to see the historical landmark that we had heard so much about. We had packed snacks, water, and a paper map to go with the GPS on both of our phones, but somehow we still managed to get lost on the way there. If you don't already know, the Cogan House Covered Bridge is located in a remote area of northeastern Lycoming County, Pennsylvania, and it's known for its historical significance as well as the legends and mysteries surrounding it. The bridge was originally built in 1877 and was one of many covered bridges that once crossed the streams and creeks of that area. The legend associated with the Cogan House Covered Bridge is that it's cursed by the ghost of a young girl who was supposedly brutalized and murdered near the bridge in the early 1900s. According to the legend, her grieving mother placed a curse on that bridge, vowing that it would never stand on its own for more than 7 years at a time. Since then, the bridge has been destroyed and rebuilt several times, and many locals claim that it is cursed. Other stories suggest that the bridge is haunted by the ghost of a man who was hanged from one of the rafters, or that it is home to a group of mischievous spirits that like to play pranks on visitors. Despite these legends, the Cogan House Covered Bridge remains a popular attraction for tourists and history buffs, and it is recognized as a National Historic Landmark. As we drove toward the Cogan House Covered Bridge on the winding road that night, we marveled at the beauty of the Pennsylvania countryside. On both sides of the road, we could see tall oaks and maples, their branches just starting to bud with new green leaves. As we approached the bridge, we noticed the fields on either side of the road were teeming with wildflowers, their colors shining in the dying light of the day. The sight of the brightly colored blooms and the sweet scent of the wildflowers wafting through the air made me feel alive. We stopped the car for a moment to take in the view and marvel at the surrounding nature. We could only hear the sound of the nearby creek gurgling and the birds chirping in the distance. It was serene and peaceful, a welcome departure from the hectic pace of the city. As we approached the bridge, we saw that it was nestled deep in the forest and that the thickets had gained an eerie appearance with only a few spears of light making their way through the trees, which had grown even thicker over the years. As the sun began to set and the darkness settled in around us, we finally arrived at the entrance to the building. We parked our car and got out, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up, as I felt as though we were being watched. Our tranquility was abruptly interrupted as soon as we heard rustling from the nearby bushes. I felt a shiver run down my spine as we looked out into the darkness, and we watched as eyes began to shine in the faint light. Suddenly a loud growling noise echoed through the trees, and my wife clutched my arm with fear. From the darkness, a towering figure emerged, with glowing golden eyes and sharp teeth. It was the legendary Pennsylvania Dogman, and it was coming straight for us. I grabbed my wife's hand, and we ran toward our car, but the creature was fast and seemed to be closing in on us. As we sprinted toward the safety of our vehicle, I could hear the heavy breath and paws pounding the ground behind us. With adrenaline pumping through my veins, we finally made it to the car, and I frantically fumbled with the keys to unlock the door. We dove inside and slammed the doors shut, the sound of the Dogman's snarls and howls filling the air around us. I could still hear him, but I wasn't sure where he was any longer. As we peeled out of the parking lot and sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling of terror that had taken hold of me. The Cogan House covered bridge may be historically significant, but I knew that would have no bearing on the fact that I would never forget the night that we encountered the Pennsylvania Dogman outside that bridge in the darkness of the night. 3. The Sachs-Covered Bridge in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I remember the night vividly when I brought my first girlfriend to the Sachs-Covered Bridge in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I had heard that it was one of the best spots for a romantic getaway, and I thought it would be a perfect place to take her. We were both in high school at the time, and I was doing everything I could to impress her. If I had known I was driving my girl right up to the doorstep of the Pennsylvania Dogman, you can bet your life I would have chosen a different place to serve as our lover's lane that night. For those of you not from the area, Sachs-Covered Bridge is a historic landmark in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This charming wooden bridge can be found on Waterworks Road and is one of the few remaining covered bridges in Adams County. Over time, Sachs-Covered Bridge has become shrouded in mystery and legend, but its history is fascinating and well documented. The bridge was built in 1852 by David Stoner, a local builder and businessman in the area. The bridge was commissioned by nearby residents who needed a way to cross Marsh Creek, which was an essential water source for the town. The bridge was named after Peter Sachs, a prominent local farmer who owned the land around the bridge. Sachs-Covered Bridge was constructed using a Burr arch truss design, which was patented by Theodore Burr in 1804. This type of truss was widely used in the 19th century and provided superior strength and support for bridges, making them more durable and able to support heavier loads. In the early days, Sachs-Covered Bridge was a popular meeting place for residents of Gettysburg. It was a common place for social gatherings, picnics, and even an occasional dance. During the Civil War, the bridge played an important role, as it was used to transport soldiers, medical supplies, and other vital materials across Marsh Creek during the Battle of Gettysburg. Over the years, the bridge has been repaired and restored several times due to damage caused by weather, flooding, and general wear and tear. In 1959, the bridge was almost destroyed when a truck carrying a load that exceeded the bridge's weight limit attempted to cross. The structural damage was so significant that the bridge had to be disassembled and stored until it could be restored and reassembled in its original location in the early 1960s. Despite the many repairs and restoration efforts, Sachs-Covered Bridge still maintains its original charm and character. Its unique design and rich history make it a popular destination for visitors to Gettysburg. However, its history is not without its spooky side. Legends and rumors have been associated with Sachs-Covered Bridge for many years, including ghost stories and strange occurrences. One of the more popular stories is about a young couple who were crossing the bridge one dark night when the horses pulling their carriage suddenly stopped in the middle of the bridge. The couple reported hearing strange whispers and seeing ghostly apparitions before the horses suddenly started moving again, allowing them to escape unharmed. Another legend associated with Sachs-covered bridge is the story of a farmer who became lost in the nearby woods. After wandering for hours, he stumbled upon the bridge and decided to rest there for the night. According to the legend, the farmer was never seen again, but his ghost is said to haunt the bridge to this day. While it is impossible to verify the accuracy of these legends, they add to the allure and mystique of Sachs-covered bridge. Today, visitors can still visit the bridge and admire its unique and beautiful design, snap a few photos, and see what they might find for themselves. One thing is for sure, Sachs-covered bridge has a rich history and a mysterious aura that will always be a part of the Gettysburg story. As we sat in my car by the bridge, we talked about everything under the sun. We were so engrossed in each other's company that we barely noticed anything else around us. However, that all changed when my girlfriend suddenly gasped and grabbed my arm tightly. I followed her gaze, and I saw a big, hairy beast crawling out from under the bridge and walking toward us on 2 legs. This was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It looked like a mix between a bear and a human, and its eyes glowed in the dim light. I was frozen with fear, but my girlfriend managed to ask, "Is that a Dogman?" Neither of us knew what to do, and I couldn't help but wonder if this was the origin of the legends of trolls living under bridges. For a moment I felt like we were in the middle of a horror movie, but then we both regained our senses and knew we had to get out of there. Both of us screamed, and I quickly revved the engine, speeding off into the night. We didn't slow down until we were miles away from that bridge. Years have passed, and she's married to someone else now. We still talk about that night sometimes on social media, though. It's one of those memories that you don't ever forget. It's tough to have heroes. Maybe it's wrong to expect so much from a her or a him. And that's why we wrote this poem or this song to a real-life hero named Godzilla Tim. Please join us in thanking today's executive producer Godzilla Tim for making this episode and so many others possible. We'd have literally sunk underwater a long time ago if not for this gentleman from across the ocean. He's a channel member twice over and uses both our PayPal donate button and our new thanks button, which you can see under any of our videos, to help fund us as well. Thank you again, Godzilla Tim. We can't thank you enough. And now here to fill in the deets about how you too can help us stay online is our international TV spokesmonger, Henry Lee Dogman. Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button. Or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more. scary stories.